In a quiet suburban neighborhood, nestled among rows of modest homes, lived a man who preferred to keep to himself. His house stood at the end of the street, a little apart from the others, with a yard that was always well kept, though there was no sense of grandeur. He had a routine: work, a simple dinner, quiet evenings spent reading or watching a bit of television. His life was straightforward, calm, and mostly uneventful. What most people didn't know, however, was that this man had a past that could send chills down anyone's spine. He was an elite Navy SEAL, one of the most skilled soldiers ever to wear the uniform. His training was rigorous and unforgiving. His body, toned and sharp, could handle anything that came his way, from combat to intense physical challenges, yet he had chosen to leave that world behind. The dangers, the constant battles, and the high-stress environment of his former life were no longer part of his plans. Now, he preferred peace, something he had fought for during his years of service. On this particular day, his routine was about to be interrupted. He had hired a crew to fix a few issues around his home, some minor repairs, a broken fence, and a few small leaks that had started to bother him. It was a normal request, something that any homeowner might do from time to time. He wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a little help to maintain his house. The crew arrived early in the morning. They were a small team, led by a foreman who seemed a little too eager to get the job done quickly. The workers didn't know who their client was. To them, he was just another man hiring them to do a job. They didn't know about the years of training that had shaped him into someone who could take on the fiercest of enemies. All they saw was a man in his late 30s living in a nice home with a yard. That was all. As the workers started to unload their tools and prepare for the day's work, the black man watched from his porch, keeping to himself. He didn't want to get involved in too much small talk, preferring instead to allow them to do their work. He didn't mind being around people, but he never enjoyed unnecessary conversation. The crew went about their business, and for a while everything seemed to go smoothly. However, things began to change when one of the workers, a young man named Jason, started to get a little too careless. The fence, which was the first thing they'd started working on, was leaning badly. Jason had been tasked with fixing it, but instead of repairing it with care, he seemed to be rushing through the job. At one point, he kicked one of the fence posts too hard, causing a section of the fence to collapse. The loud crash broke the calm of the morning, causing the black man to stand up from his seat on the porch. He walked over to see what had happened. "Hey, take it easy with that," he called out, his voice calm but firm. He wasn't angry. He wasn't the type to lose his temper. But the tone in his voice made it clear that he wasn't pleased with the way the job was being handled. Jason, clearly embarrassed, muttered an apology, but the damage had already been done. The fence was broken, and that was just the beginning. The crew leader, a man named Paul, walked over to assess the damage. He was a little older than the rest of the team, a bit more experienced, but his temperament was more irritable than calm. "Jason, what the hell did you do?" Paul barked, looking at the broken fence. Jason quickly tried to explain, but Paul wasn't listening. Instead, he turned to the black man. "You should have told him to be more careful," Paul said, his tone almost accusatory. The black man raised an eyebrow. "I'm not your supervisor," he replied, keeping his voice level. "I'm just the homeowner." Paul seemed to bristle at the response. "Well, if you were paying attention, maybe we wouldn't have had this problem." The tension in the air thickened. The black man knew when to walk away from a situation, but there was something about Paul's attitude that rubbed him the wrong way. Instead of defusing the tension, the confrontation was escalating, slowly but surely. "Look," the black man said, taking a step back. "I don't want to cause a scene, but I hired you to fix my house, not break it, so let's keep it civil, all right?" The workers, sensing the tension, started to get uneasy. One of them, a burly man named Tom, muttered something under his breath as if he were talking about the black man's character. The black man, catching the remark, narrowed his eyes. His training had taught him to stay calm under pressure, but the insensitivity of the situation was starting to wear on him. He wasn't just a man who could stand by and let people walk all over him. He had dealt with far worse in his past, but what bothered him now was the attitude, the dismissiveness. They didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't understand the gravity of the situation. Paul seemed to sense that the black man wasn't the type to let things slide, so he tried to shift gears. Look, let's just focus on getting the job done. We'll make it right, all right? Paul's tone was less aggressive now, but it was still condescending. The black man nodded slowly, not trusting the situation. He stood there for a moment, weighing his options. He didn't want to cause a scene, but he also didn't want to be taken for granted. The air felt charged, as if something was about to snap. The workers got back to their tasks, but the damage was done. The mood had shifted. The black man turned around and walked back to his porch, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to end well. There was something in the way they spoke to him, something in the way Paul had treated him like a lesser person. It was a feeling he knew all too well, one that his training had prepared him for, the same kind of feeling he had encountered on missions where people underestimated him. He couldn't help but wonder, was that what was happening here? Were they underestimating him? He sat back down on the porch, trying to push away the unease in his gut. He wasn't sure how things would unfold, but he was prepared for whatever came next. It was only a matter of time before the situation would escalate further. The morning passed slowly after the tension had risen between the black man and the crew. The workers were back to their tasks, but the atmosphere had changed. It wasn't just about fixing a fence anymore. There was something unspoken, a feeling of discomfort in the air. The black man had tried to brush it off, but a knot in his stomach told him something wasn't right. He sat on the porch, trying to focus on the simple things around him, the birds chirping, the rustle of the leaves in the wind. It was the kind of peaceful setting he had fought for in his life, the kind of life he had dreamed of. But now it was interrupted by the careless actions of strangers, people who couldn't see past their prejudices and assumptions. The workers, for their part, seemed to sense that things weren't as they should be. They tried to get back to their work, but their focus had shifted. The black man wasn't someone they could just walk over. His presence seemed to weigh heavily on them now. They could tell he wasn't a man to be disrespected, though they couldn't quite place why. There was a quiet authority about him that left them uneasy, and their efforts to fix the fence now seemed even more haphazard. The foreman, Paul, called the workers over to discuss the next steps, but the tone of his voice had softened considerably. It was no longer the harsh command he had used earlier. Instead, he tried to appear more understanding, though the underlying tension was still there. It didn't go unnoticed by the black man, who observed them quietly from the porch. As the workers worked on, the black man noticed something else. They were rushing. Their once careful steps had turned into hurried, careless movements. The fence had now become a symbol of their failure to meet expectations. Every strike of the hammer felt off. Every movement seemed rushed, and it was clear that the crew wasn't paying attention to the details anymore. He could tell that their sense of urgency was born from something more than just the need to finish the job. They were trying to finish it before the situation got any worse, and then it happened. One of the workers, a tall, thin man who had been mostly quiet throughout the morning, dropped a tool. It wasn't just any tool, it was a hammer, one that had slipped from his grasp in his haste. The tool struck the ground with a loud clang, sending a shock through the air. For a moment, the only sound was the lingering echo of the fall. The black man stood up from the porch, feeling the shift in the atmosphere once again. He walked over, his movements deliberate but calm. There was no anger in his step, but it was clear that he wasn't about to let another mistake slide by unnoticed. The crew froze as he approached, their heads turning to him, eyes wide with a mixture of apprehension and guilt. "Is there a problem?" the black man asked quietly, his voice carrying just enough weight to be heard, but not too much to sound threatening. Paul quickly cleared his throat, trying to regain some authority. No problem at all," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. "We're just getting things back in order." The black man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped forward and took a good look at the damaged fence. He could see where things had gone wrong. The posts weren't set properly, the fence was uneven, and now the whole thing looked like it might collapse at any moment. But what bothered him most wasn't the fence itself. It was the lack of care the workers were showing. They were just going through the motions, not taking the time to do the job right, and that didn't sit well with him. "Listen," the black man said, his voice growing firmer now. "I understand mistakes happen, but if you're going to work here, you need to take your time and do it right." Paul opened his mouth to respond, but the black man raised a hand, stopping him. "I'm not here to fight with you," he continued, "but I'm paying for a service. If you can't handle the job, I'll find someone else who can. The words hung in the air like a challenge, but the black man's tone remained calm, almost too calm. He wasn't yelling, wasn't getting worked up, but there was no mistaking the seriousness in his voice. The workers exchanged uneasy glances. The crew leader looked like he was about to say something but then seemed to think better of it. Paul cleared his throat again, his earlier bravado now gone. All right, he said, sounding tired. We'll fix it, make sure it's right, no more mistakes. The black man nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the group. He wasn't going to let this slide, not this time. But as the workers began their repairs again, the black man's instincts started to kick in. His training had taught him to always be aware of his surroundings, to never let his guard down no matter the situation. And there was something off about this. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was an undercurrent of something he didn't like. The workers were moving in a way that wasn't just rushed. It was as if they were trying to finish the job as quickly as possible, without caring about the quality of the work. He stepped back, watching them carefully. As he did, he saw Paul talk quietly to one of the workers, a hushed conversation that didn't sit right with him. The black man's ears perked up and he strained to hear what was being said. You think he'll notice? The worker asked. I don't know, Paul answered, his voice low and tense. But we can't keep messing around like this. Let's get out of here before things get worse. The words sent a chill down the black man's spine. Something wasn't right. His gut told him that the workers were not just struggling with the job. They were trying to get away with something. Maybe they didn't realize who they were dealing with. But the black man knew better than to ignore his instincts. As he turned to walk back toward his porch, his mind raced. He wasn't going to let them off the hook so easily. They might think they could rush through this job and get away with it, but he wasn't about to let them destroy his property and walk away without consequences. He paused for a moment, considering his next steps. He wasn't one to make threats, but sometimes people needed to understand that actions had consequences. He couldn't let this go. Not after everything he had been through. As he turned back, toward the crew, ready to confront them one last time, he knew this wasn't going to end quietly. It wasn't just about a broken fence anymore. It was about respect, about taking responsibility for your actions, and he wasn't going to let them forget that. The workers seemed to feel the weight of the situation as the black man turned back toward them. His every move was deliberate, and despite the calm in his demeanor, the tension in the air was palpable. The crew knew something had changed. They weren't just dealing with any homeowner. This man was someone different, someone they hadn't expected. The crew had made their mistakes, and now they had to face the consequences. As the black man made his way back to the workers, his instincts were sharp. The sense of urgency they were showing wasn't just about getting the job done. It was about getting away from something they hadn't quite anticipated. Paul the foreman had been trying to keep things calm, but his attempts were beginning to show cracks. He was a bit shaken, unsure of how to handle the growing tension. He tried to act like he was still in charge, but the workers were looking at him for guidance, and he wasn't sure what to tell them anymore. He could feel the shift in the black man's energy. It wasn't angry, but it was strong and focused, and Paul wasn't sure he could control it. The black man stopped just short of the workers, standing tall, arms crossed, his eyes scanning each of them. He wasn't there to start trouble, but he wasn't going to back down either. He had been through far worse situations before, and this was nothing compared to the real dangers he had faced in his past life. Yet the way these workers were behaving, like they were trying to escape something, had triggered something inside him. His training had prepared him for any number of challenges, but it had also taught him to recognize when something wasn't right. "How's it going?" he asked, his voice steady, almost too steady. Paul opened his mouth to speak but hesitated. The question wasn't just about the fence anymore. It was a challenge, one that demanded an answer. The foreman was struggling to come up with a response, his mind racing. How could he explain the situation to the black man without making it worse? His crew was clearly nervous, and the last thing Paul wanted was to make things even more uncomfortable. "We're almost done," Paul said, but the words didn't sound convincing. There was something in the way he said it, an edge of uncertainty, like he wasn't entirely sure of what he was saying. The black man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced over at the workers who were trying to continue their tasks. But their movements were rushed, their focus scattered. He could see it now. They weren't just working to finish. They were working to escape. Escape from what? He wondered. Were they afraid of something or someone? He had learned to read people, especially when they were hiding something. His time as a Navy SEAL had taught him that. It wasn't about being suspicious of everyone, but it was about noticing the small signs, the subtle shifts in behavior that betrayed the truth. The way the workers were acting was telling him everything he needed to know. "Something's off," he said, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of authority. "What are you hiding from?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Paul stiffened, his eyes darting between the black man and the workers. The crew were exchanging nervous glances, but no one answered. It was clear that the tension had reached its peak. "I don't know what you mean," Paul said, his voice strained. The black man didn't buy it. He had heard enough evasions to know when someone wasn't being honest. He took a step closer to Paul, his gaze intense. "You can lie to me, but I know when I'm being played," the black man said, his tone unwavering. "The way you're rushing, the way you're trying to avoid the problem, it's clear something's not right." Paul shifted uneasily. He wanted to brush it off, to end the conversation and get back to the job, but he knew he couldn't. Not now. He had to face whatever it was they were avoiding, and it seemed like the black man wasn't going to let it go. A tense silence fell over the group, each worker looking around, unsure of how to react. The black man's presence was undeniable now. He wasn't just some homeowner who could be pushed around. He was someone who commanded respect whether they liked it or not. "I don't know what you're talking about," Paul repeated, his voice shaking slightly. The black man sighed, his arms uncrossing as he took another step forward. "Look," he said, his voice softer now but still carrying that weight. "I'm not here to cause trouble, but I'm not going to let you disrespect me or my home. You're acting like you're scared of something. I want to know what it is." Paul hesitated. He could feel the pressure mounting. This wasn't just about offense anymore. It wasn't even about the job. It was about pride, about control, and about being exposed. He had been trying to protect his crew, to protect whatever it was they had gotten themselves into. But now it was clear that he wasn't going to be able to hide it any longer. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Paul spoke. His voice was quieter now, tinged with frustration. "We're not the ones you need to be worried about," he said. "We've got our own problems, and you don't want to get caught up in them." The words hit the black man like a brick. It wasn't just a simple excuse, there was something more to it and something deeper. He could tell that Paul was trying to protect them from something, but what? "What do you mean?" the black man asked, his voice low but pressing. Paul glanced around as if trying to decide whether or not to reveal more. The workers were still standing by, unsure of how to act, but it was clear that they were all on edge. The black man could see the fear in their eyes now, and it was hard to ignore. These weren't just workers trying to avoid a tough job. They were scared of something much bigger. "We made a deal," Paul said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A deal that, well, it wasn't exactly legal." The black man's brow furrowed. "What kind of deal?" Paul shook his head. "I can't say much more than that. But if you're smart, you'll stay out of it. You don't want to get involved." The black man was silent for a moment, processing the information. Something wasn't right. The workers weren't just afraid of their mistakes or getting caught by their boss. They were afraid of something much bigger, something that was hanging over them like a dark cloud. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His instincts were screaming at him to dig deeper, to find out exactly what was going on. But there was something else, too. A sense that he was getting too close to something dangerous. For a moment, he considered walking away, leaving it all behind. After all, it wasn't his problem. But then he remembered the way they had treated him, the way they had disrespected his home. And suddenly, it didn't matter how dangerous things might get. He wasn't going to let anyone walk all over him. "Not today. I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly. "You're not getting." Off that easy. I want answers now. The crew stood frozen, waiting for what would come next. The black man had made it clear that he wasn't going to back down. And now it seemed it was time for the workers to face the consequences of their actions. The tension in the air was thick. The black man stood firm, not letting up, his gaze steady. Paul had said enough to open the door. But now it was clear that he wasn't just talking about the fence anymore. There was something much deeper at play. Something that had shaken the crew to their core. The workers stood still, their eyes darting between Paul and the black man. They weren't sure how this would unfold, but they knew it wouldn't be pretty. There was a sense of inevitability in the air, like they were all trapped in something they couldn't escape. The black man was no longer just a homeowner. He was someone who knew how to dig deeper, to ask the right questions and make people answer. "All right," Paul said after a long pause, clearly struggling with the weight of the situation. "We made a deal with the wrong people. That's the truth. We've been working for a guy who's got connections to some pretty dangerous people. People you don't want to mess with." The black man raised an eyebrow. Dangerous people? The last thing he wanted was to be involved in someone else's mess, but this was clearly no ordinary job. The crew's fear was palpable, and the way Paul spoke made it clear that they were in too deep to back out now. "I thought you said you were just fixing a fence," the black man said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of frustration. "Now you're telling me you've gotten tangled up with some criminals?" Paul's face was grim, his eyes darting nervously toward his crew. "It wasn't supposed to go like this. We were just doing some simple work, right?" But then the guy we were working for started making strange requests. Weird materials, things that didn't make sense. We should have walked away, but we didn't, and now we're stuck. The black man took a step forward, his stance unwavering. "Stuck with what? What kind of requests? What did you get involved in?" Paul seemed hesitant. He was clearly torn, unsure of how much to reveal. But the black man wasn't backing down. His eyes were fixed on Paul, and there was an intensity in them that made it clear. This wasn't a conversation that could be avoided. Paul's crew may have been scared, but he wasn't. And that was becoming increasingly obvious. "I don't know how to explain it," Paul said, his voice cracking slightly. "But we started getting jobs from this guy. Small jobs at first, fixing fences, painting walls. Then it got darker. We were asked to transport things, materials we weren't allowed to ask about. We didn't know what was in them, but we should have known better than to go along with it. It was like we were being pulled into something bigger, something we didn't want to be part of." The black man stood silently for a moment, processing what Paul had said. The workers had gotten involved with something shady, and now they were stuck in a situation they couldn't control. It wasn't just about the fence anymore. It was about a much larger web of danger, one that was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. "Who is this guy?" the black man asked. "Who's behind this?" Paul shook his head. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I know that the people he's working with, they're dangerous. They've got connections all over, and they're not afraid to use them. If they find out we've been talking, we're all dead." The black man's mind raced. This was more than just a bad job gone wrong. These weren't just reckless workers, and they were caught in something much bigger, something he didn't want any part of. But as much as he wanted to walk away, something in him told him that this wasn't over. They needed to get out. They needed to fix this. He couldn't let these people think they could do whatever they wanted without consequences. "Do you have a plan?" the black man asked, his voice steady. Paul didn't respond immediately. He looked down at his feet, avoiding the black man's gaze. It was clear that there was no plan, no easy way out. The crew was lost, caught up in something they couldn't escape. And that was exactly what the black man had feared. "You've got to get out," the black man said, his voice firm. "This isn't just about a broken fence anymore. You've got to leave, or things are going to get a whole lot worse." The workers shifted uncomfortably, exchanging nervous glances. They weren't sure if they could just leave. They had already gone too far, done things they couldn't take back. But they also knew that staying would only make things worse. Paul looked at the black man, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and fear. "I don't know if we can just walk away," he said, his voice cracking. "We've already gone too far." The black man was silent for a moment, weighing his options. He could just walk away. He didn't have to get involved. But something inside him told him that if he left now, things would spiral even further out of control. These workers were in over their heads, and if he didn't help them, no one would. "I'll help you," the black man said, his voice low but steady. "But you've got to trust me. You can't run from this. If you keep hiding, they'll come after you. And when they do, there won't be a way out. The workers seemed to perk up slightly at his words, but there was still a sense of fear in their eyes. They didn't want to drag anyone else into their mess. They had made enough mistakes already. How are you going to help us? Paul asked, his voice hesitant. The black man's eyes hardened. I'm not going to let them get away with this. You're not in this alone. I'll make sure you get out of this, but you need to follow my lead. No more running, no more hiding. The words were simple, but they carried weight. The crew didn't know exactly what the black man had in mind, but they could see that he was serious. He wasn't just offering empty promises. He had a plan, and they needed to trust him if they wanted to survive. There was a long pause before Paul finally nodded. All right, he said quietly. We'll do whatever it takes. But we don't know where to start. The black man gave a small nod. You start by listening, and when I say move, you move. I'll take care of the rest. It was a small step, but it was enough to get the crew to realize that they weren't alone anymore. They had made mistakes, yes, but they had also made a choice to trust someone who knew what he was doing, someone who could help them make it out of this alive. The black man turned to face the workers. We don't have much time. Get your things together. We're moving out. And when we do, we're not looking back. The air had never felt so tense. The black man had laid out the plan, and the workers had agreed to follow. There was no turning back now. They were deep in it, and the only way out was through. The crew, once just a group of strangers who had arrived to fix a fence, were now united by a single terrifying truth. They had gotten in too deep. And the only hope of making it out was to trust the man who stood before them, the one who knew how to survive, the one who wasn't afraid. The black man had watched enough to know that time was running out. He had seen enough fear in their eyes to know that they were looking for answers, but there was no time to give them all the answers. There was only time to act. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but one thing was clear. This wasn't going to be solved by talking. It would be solved by action, and it would take every bit of strength, focus, and courage they had left. Listen up, the black man said, his voice firm. You're going to stick close to me. No one talks. No one panics, and no one moves unless I say so. The crew nodded, some of them still unsure, but all of them sensing the gravity of the situation. They had gone too far, and now it was up to this man, this stranger, to guide them out. He wasn't just giving them instructions. He was giving them a lifeline. The black man surveyed the area. He knew the crew wasn't equipped for a fight, but he was. His years as a Navy SEAL had prepared him for moments like this, moments when everything was on the line. This wasn't a typical job. This wasn't about a broken fence or a small misunderstanding. This was bigger than all of them, and he wasn't going to let these men fall victim to it. We're going to the old warehouse, the black man said, his eyes scanning the workers. It's the last place they'll look for us. They'll think we're trying to run. But we're not running. We're getting ready to fight. Paul swallowed hard. You think they'll come after us? He asked, his voice shaky. The black man looked at him squarely. They already are. They've been watching us for days. They knew this job was a setup, and now they know we're onto them. The crew, still rattled, exchanged nervous glances. The black man's words were clear and unflinching, but the weight of the situation was sinking in. They had no idea how to fight people like this. People who had their own network, their own protection. The thought of facing them sent chills down their spines. But the black man had already made it clear. There was no running. They moved quickly, gathering their tools and personal belongings. The black man kept his eyes sharp, scanning every corner of the street, every passing car, every movement in the distance. His instincts were honed, his mind focused, and his body was prepared for whatever came next. Stay close, the black man said, turning to the workers. No talking, no distractions, just keep moving. They made their way down the street, walking as casually as they could manage, but the tension in the air was thick. Every car that passed by seemed to carry more weight. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. But the black K-man was in control, and his calm steadied the crew, even if they didn't fully understand the danger they were in. As they approached the warehouse, the black man led the group to a side entrance, one that was hidden from view. It was a tight squeeze, but they managed to get inside without drawing attention. The warehouse was dark and empty, a perfect hiding spot, at least for now. But it wouldn't be long before they would have to face the truth of what was coming. They couldn't hide forever. Inside the warehouse, the black man immediately got to work, scanning the space for anything useful. There were crates and boxes scattered around, but they didn't have time to organize. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. The crew was still shaken, unsure of what was coming, but the black man was focused. He motioned for the workers to gather around. "Listen up," he said. "We don't have time to sit around. We need to be ready when they come. We don't know when or where, but we know they'll come. So we're going to prepare." He started to move through the warehouse, checking the exits, the windows, and every corner. His mind was racing. He knew they couldn't stay here forever. And he knew the people they were up against wouldn't just walk away. The only way out was to face them head on, and that meant making a stand. "We can't fight them head on," the black man said, turning back to the crew. "But we can make them think we're ready. We can make them second-guess their next move." He knew the stakes. He had seen situations like this before, situations where every decision mattered. The crew didn't have the skills or experience to go up against real danger. But they didn't need to. What they needed was a strategy, something that would make the enemy hesitate, something that would make them question whether it was worth coming after them. The black man gathered the crew around and began to form a plan. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy them time. They would set up traps, create distractions, and use the terrain to their advantage. It wouldn't be a fight, at least not one they could win in the traditional sense. But it was a chance, and that's all they had. "We set the traps here, here, and here," the black man said, pointing to strategic areas of the warehouse. "We make them believe we're prepared, and we make them think twice before coming after us. We don't need to win this fight. We just need to survive it." The workers, though scared, nodded. They were starting to see the plan come together, and the black man's confidence gave them something to hold on to. They didn't know if it would work, but they knew they had no other choice but to trust him. Hours passed as they worked in silence, setting up makeshift barriers, tying ropes, and placing objects in key positions. The warehouse was transformed from a dark, empty space into a labyrinth of distractions and obstacles. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. As night fell, the black man gathered the crew once more. "It's time," he said. "Get ready. They'll be here soon." The crew took their positions, each of them feeling the weight of what was about to happen. They were scared, but there was no turning back. The black man's calm demeanor had given them strength, but now they had to face the truth. The danger was real, and the stakes were high. Outside, the sounds of footsteps echoed in the distance. The black man's senses were sharp, his focus razor-thin.
He knew they were coming.
He could hear them, feel them closing in. This was the moment. "Stay quiet," the black man whispered, his voice steady but urgent. "No matter what happens, stay quiet." The crew held their breath, waiting for the first sign that the danger had arrived. Then, the door to the warehouse creaked open. The door to the warehouse creaked, and the crew held their breath. The black man's instincts were sharp, and every fiber of his being was focused on the sound. The silence in the room was deafening, and it felt like time had slowed to a crawl. He knew they didn't have much time. The enemy was closing in, and they had to be ready. The black man motioned for the crew to stay low, to remain hidden in the shadows. He moved quietly, scanning the area for any sign of movement. His mind was clear, calculating. He had trained for moments like this, and now everything depended on their ability to stay calm and focused. He could hear the muffled footsteps outside the door, growing louder with every passing second. They were close. Too close. He glanced at the crew, his eyes locking with Paul's. There was fear in Paul's eyes, but there was also something else. Determination. The crew wasn't just following instructions now. They were fighting for their lives. The black man knew they had to be strategic. There was no room for mistakes. If they did nothing, the enemy would come in and overwhelm them. But if they acted fast enough, if they caught them off guard, they might stand a chance. "Get ready," the black man whispered to the crew. "When I say so, we move." The crew nodded, each of them doing their best to stay still. The tension was suffocating, but they had learned to trust the black man. His calm confidence had been their anchor through the chaos, and now they had to rely on him more than ever. The footsteps outside grew louder, and the door was slowly pushed open. The first figure appeared, silhouetted in the dim light, scanning the warehouse with suspicion. The black man's heart raced, but his body remained still, every muscle tense and ready. "Hold," the black man whispered, his voice barely audible. The crew stayed frozen, their eyes wide with fear. They knew what was coming, but none of them could predict what would happen next. The figure stepped further into the warehouse, followed by another. The black man's mind raced, his hand inching closer to the trigger of the trap they had set. The moment had arrived. There was no turning back now. Now, the black man shouted. With that single command, chaos erupted. The crew sprang into action, using the obstacles they had set up earlier to their advantage. They slammed objects onto the floor to create noise, drawing the attention of the intruders. At the same time, the black man moved with lightning speed, setting off the trap he had prepared. A series of ropes snapped into place, creating a tangled mess that threw the enemy off balance. The intruders stumbled, disoriented by the sudden attack. They hadn't expected this kind of resistance. The black man's quick thinking and strategic planning had taken them by surprise. The crew had followed his lead, and now the enemies were on the back foot. "Keep moving," the black man ordered, his voice commanding and firm. "Push them back! Don't let them regroup." The crew worked together, using every inch of the warehouse to their advantage. They took cover behind crates and boxes, firing makeshift weapons and throwing whatever they could get their hands on. It wasn't a conventional fight, but it was a fight, and they were holding their ground. The enemy, though clearly startled, quickly regained their composure. They were armed, and they weren't going down easily. The black man knew this was just the beginning. They had to keep the pressure on, make them think they were more of a threat than they really were. "Stay with me," the black man shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Stay focused. Don't let them get close." The crew responded, pushing forward with renewed energy. They were scared, but they were fighting for something more than just survival. They were fighting for control, for the chance to escape this nightmare alive. They had no experience in combat, but they had something just as powerful: the will to survive. The black man led them through the maze of the warehouse, moving quickly and silently, like a shadow in the night. His training had kicked in, and every move he made was precise. He could hear the enemy closing in, but he had a plan. They couldn't stay in the warehouse forever, and he knew that if they wanted to get out alive, they needed a way out. "Back to the side door," the black man shouted, motioning for the crew to follow him. "We've got to get out of here before they bring reinforcements." The crew moved quickly, adrenaline fueling their every step. They reached the side door, but as they tried to open it, they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind them. The enemy was closing in fast, and they weren't going to let them escape without a fight. "Move! Move!" the black man ordered, his voice sharp. "Get out now!" The crew burst through the side door, sprinting into the alleyway outside. The black man was the last to leave, ensuring that everyone else made it out first. He knew that once they were outside, they would have a better chance of escaping, but it wouldn't be easy. The enemy wasn't far behind. As they ran down the alley, the black man kept his eyes on the rear, making sure they weren't being followed. The adrenaline was coursing through his veins, but he kept his mind focused. They had to get to a safer location, and they had to get there fast. "Keep moving," the black man shouted, urging the crew to run faster. "Don't stop until we're clear." They ran through the narrow streets, zigzagging through alleys and side roads, doing everything they could to throw off anyone who might be chasing them. It was a race against time, and they could hear the enemy closing in behind them, but the black man was determined. He wouldn't let them be caught. Not after everything they had been through. As they neared a safer part of town, the black man looked over his shoulder one last time. The enemy was still chasing them, but they were slowing down. The black man had expected them to be more prepared, but they had underestimated him. He had outsmarted them, and now they were on the run. "We're almost there," the black man shouted. "Keep moving! Don't look back!" The crew pushed on, their legs burning with exhaustion, but they didn't stop. They could see the safety of the next block up ahead. It was just a matter of getting there before the enemy caught up. As they reached the safety of the next block, the black man gave one last glance over his shoulder. The enemy had stopped chasing them, realizing that they weren't going to catch up. They had lost, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the crew allowed themselves to breathe. They had made it out. The black man turned to face them, his expression serious but calm. "We're not out of the woods yet," he said, his voice steady. "But we've got a chance, and that's more than we had before." The crew looked at him, their faces filled with a mix of exhaustion, relief, and gratitude. They had made it through the worst of it. And while they knew there was still more to face, they also knew that they had survived because they had worked together. because they had trusted him. And now, they were ready to do whatever it took to make sure they never had to face that kind of danger again. The group stood in the quiet of the alleyway, trying to catch their breath after the chaotic escape. Their hearts were still racing and sweat dripped from their faces. They had just outrun the people who had been chasing them for what felt like an eternity. But even though they had managed to slip away, none of them felt safe yet. The black man knew that they couldn't afford to relax just yet. They had taken a big step in surviving, but there was more work to be done. "Stay sharp," the black man said, his voice calm but firm. He knew the crew was exhausted, but they couldn't afford to slow down. "We're not clear yet. They'll be back, and when they come, we need to be ready." Paul wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, nodding. "How do you know they'll come after us again?" His voice was hoarse, and it was clear that he was running on fumes. The rest of the crew looked just as worn out, but there was a glimmer of determination in their eyes. They weren't ready to give up, not after everything they had been through. "They won't stop," the black man said. "This isn't over. We've made it through one fight, but they're not going to let us off that easy. The people behind this are dangerous. They won't stop until they've made an example out of us." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. They had heard enough to understand that the danger they were facing wasn't just some random gang or petty criminals. These were people who had power, who had resources, and who wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took to get what they wanted. "We can't just keep running," Paul said, shaking his head. "We need to figure out what's going on." "We need answers," the black man nodded. "I agree. But we need to be smart about it. We can't go barging in blindly. If we do, we'll end up making things worse. Right now, our priority is getting somewhere safe, regrouping, and making a plan." The crew was quiet for a moment, the weight of their situation sinking in. They had been thrust into a world they hadn't prepared for, a world filled with people who had no hesitation to use force, manipulation, or fear to get what they wanted. And now they were in the middle of it. But despite the danger, they knew they couldn't back down. The black man had shown them that fighting wasn't just about fighting back physically. It was about using their brains, their resourcefulness, and their willingness to push forward when things seemed impossible. "We need to move," the black man said, snapping the crew out of their thoughts. "Let's find a place to lay low for a while. Somewhere we can regroup and figure out our next step." They nodded and followed him, their footsteps muffled in the quiet streets. The black man kept a sharp eye out for any signs of danger. His senses were heightened, every movement and sound amplified in his mind. He had been through situations like this before, and he knew how quickly things could turn from bad to worse. He didn't want to take any chances. After a few more turns, they came to a small rundown motel. It wasn't the best place, but it would do for now. The black man led the crew inside, making sure to keep an eye on their surroundings. The motel was nearly empty, with only a few people lounging around in the lobby. No one paid them any attention as they checked in, but the black man wasn't fooled. He knew that the less attention they drew, the better. They made their way to their rooms, and once the door was closed behind them, the crew finally allowed themselves to relax, just a little. They were safe for now. But the black man knew it was only temporary. They couldn't stay here long. "Not with the people they were up against. Get some rest," the black man said, his voice low. "But don't get comfortable. We need to stay alert. I'll take the first shift watching the door. You guys sleep and we'll talk in a few hours." The crew nodded, their exhaustion clear on their faces. They had barely slept in the past few days, and the constant fear had drained them. But they knew better than to ignore the black man's warning. They needed to stay ready. The next few hours passed slowly. The black man sat by the door, his mind running through a million different scenarios. He thought about the people they were up against, about what they wanted, and about what they would do next. But more than that, he thought about the crew. They had come so far and they had learned so much. He wasn't about to let them fall back into the hands of these dangerous people. Finally, as the sun began to set, the crew started to stir. They were still tired, but they knew they couldn't waste any more time. They had to keep moving. They had to find out who was behind all this and what their next step should be. The black man looked up as they gathered around the small table in the room. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "We've got to figure out where we go from here. I'm not going to lie, we're in deep. But we've made it this far, and we're not giving up now." Paul spoke up, his voice still hoarse but determined. "What's the plan? How do we get out of this?" The black man met his gaze. "First, we need to find out who we're dealing with. We can't go after them blindly. But I have a few contacts, people who can help us get some information. Contacts? One of the workers asked, looking skeptical. The black man nodded. People who know things. Who can get us the information we need without drawing too much attention. We're going to find out who's behind this, and once we know that, we can start making our moves. But what if they're already onto us? Another worker asked. What if they come after us here? The black man's expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp. That's a risk we have to take. We can't hide forever, but we'll be smart about it. We're not going to let them get the drop on us. He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. We stick together, we stay focused, and we don't make any rash decisions. We fight smart and we fight hard. And when the time comes, we'll make them regret ever messing with us. The crew was silent for a moment, the gravity of the situation sinking in. They had been thrown into a world of danger, but they weren't going to let it break them. They had survived this far, and with the black man's leadership, they knew they could make it through the rest. The black man stood up, his eyes scanning the room one last time. Get ready. We're moving out soon. We don't have time to waste. The crew stood up as well, ready to follow his lead. They had no illusions about the dangers ahead, but they were determined. They had learned that the only way to survive was to keep moving forward, no matter the odds. They had made it this far, and they were going to keep fighting until the very end. The night was still, almost too quiet, as the black man stood at the window of the motel room, looking out into the dark streets. He knew they couldn't stay here much longer. The longer they lingered, the higher the chance they'd be found. He wasn't paranoid. He was just experienced. The people they were dealing with were relentless, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. Behind him, the crew sat in the room, restless, but trying to stay as calm as possible. Everyone knew the next move would be crucial. They had come this far, but the danger was far from over. The black man turned back to them, his face serious but calm. We can't stay here long, he said. We need to find out who's behind this, but we need to do it carefully. There's a plan, but we have to be ready for anything. It's not just about surviving anymore, it's about taking control. Paul, who had been quiet for the most part, stood up and nodded. I get it. But how do we even start? Who do we trust? The black man's eyes darkened slightly, his voice low. That's the hard part. Trust is in short supply right now, but we have a few ways to find out what we need. I've got some people who can help, but we have to be discreet. We can't afford to draw attention. The crew exchanged looks. It was clear they were all still rattled from their earlier encounter, but they were also starting to understand the gravity of the situation. They weren't just trying to survive anymore. They were involved in something much bigger, something dangerous. We can't just sit here forever, one of the crew members said, his voice anxious. We need to move, do something. The black man looked at him and nodded. You're right. We'll move when we're ready, but rushing in blindly will get us all killed. For the next hour, the group went over their options, talking in low voices, trying to make sense of their situation. The black man was the one in control now. He was calm, strategic, and focused. He knew how to plan, how to stay 2 steps ahead. The crew was starting to realize that without him, they would have never made it this far. Finally, the black man stood up, signaling that it was time to act. All right, we move in the morning. We'll head to one of my contacts. They'll be able to help us figure out who's behind this. The crew nodded, some of them still unsure but willing to follow his lead. They knew the risks, but they also knew they didn't have many options left. The night passed quietly, and in the morning they packed up, prepared to move once again. The black man led the way, walking with a sense of purpose. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew they couldn't wait any longer. If they stayed in one place too long, it would only be a matter of time before the enemy found them. They needed information, and they needed it fast. The black man took them to a small, unassuming building on the edge of town. It was the kind of place people passed by without a second thought, which was exactly why it was perfect. His contact, a man he had worked with before, ran a small business out of the building. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep things off the radar. They entered the building quietly, keeping a low profile. Inside it was dimly lit, filled with shelves of old electronics and random tools. The place smelled faintly of dust and metal. At the back of the room, a man was hunched over a workbench, tinkering with something. When he heard the door open, he looked up, his expression hardening when he saw the black man. Didn't think I'd see you again, the man said, standing up slowly. His voice was rough, but there was an understanding in his eyes. He knew what kind of people the black man worked with, and he knew the dangers that came with that. "I need your help," the black man said, keeping his voice steady. "We're looking for information. People are after us, and we need to know who's behind it." The man nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the group. He could tell they were out of their depth, but that was nothing new. "You came to the right place," he said, his tone almost casual. "But it's not going to be easy. You're not the first people to ask about these guys." "Then you know who they are?" the black man asked, his voice urgent. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over to a small desk in the corner of the room and opened a drawer, pulling out a thick folder. He flipped through it for a moment before stopping on a particular page. He handed it over to the black man, who quickly scanned the contents. The name at the top sent a cold shiver down his spine. It was a name he hadn't expected to see. "This is who's behind it," the man said, his voice quieter now. "They're not just any criminal organization. These guys are connected, powerful. If they're after you, you've already been marked." The black man's grip tightened around the folder. "Who are they? What do they want?" The man sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You really want to know? They're not people you want to mess with. This isn't just about money or power. They operate in the shadows and they don't leave loose ends. Whoever you've pissed off, they're going to come after you with everything they've got." The black man looked at the rest of the crew. Their faces were pale and he could see the fear creeping in. But he also saw something else, determination. They weren't going to back down. They couldn't afford to. "Not now. We need to get out of here," the black man said, closing the folder. "They'll come looking for us here. We've got the information we need, but now it's time to move." The man nodded, grabbing his jacket. "I'll cover you. But remember, this isn't over. They won't stop." As they made their way out of the building, the black man felt the weight of what they had just learned. The enemy was more powerful than he had imagined, and the road ahead would only get more dangerous. But there was no turning back now. They piled into the vehicle the black man had arranged, heading to a safe location. As they drove, the black man thought about the information they had uncovered. He wasn't going to let these people destroy him or the crew. They had come too far. They had survived too much. And now it was time to turn the tables. "We have to take the fight to them," the black man said, his voice hard. "They've been hunting us for too long. It's time we made them regret it." The crew was silent for a moment, processing his words. They had always been on the defensive, running and hiding. But now they were going to make a stand. They had learned from the best, and they weren't going to let fear control them anymore. As they reached their new hideout, the black man turned to them, his eyes burning with resolve. "This is it," he said. "We're not backing down. We'll fight smart. We'll fight together. And we'll make them wish they'd never messed with us." The crew looked back at him, their expressions shifting from fear to determination. They weren't sure how this would end, but they knew one thing for sure. They weren't going to give up. They had come this far, and now it was time to take the fight back to the enemy.